Hi, thank you for watching this presentation today. So my interest in this topic started in 2012 when I was teaching on the UCL pre-sessional course, and a student who'd been advised to make changes to her criticality and structure in her essay made cursory changes to spelling and grammar, handed the essay in, and as a result failed the course and had to return to her country. So since then I've been interested in what we can do as practitioners to help students to engage with their feedback. And this led to a doctorate and also a recent paper in assessment and evaluation in higher education, in which I lay out my model and the literature on which it's based. And today I'm going to be talking about some of these things. I'm going to be explaining the model that I came up with and that I published recently. And in this talk I'm going to be talking about how I turned this into a study that examined online dialogic feedback practices, dialogic peer feedback practices. I'll talk about the methodology, the results, and implications and conclusions for EAP practitioners. So first of all, we know that feedback is one of the most powerful things that we can do to help students learn. But the impacts are also very variable. And feedback is one of the least popular aspects of higher education practice, and it has been so for 10 years, and it's also true in China and Australia and possibly in more places too. And we know that for feedback to be effective, it has to be used to alter the gap between current and ideal performance. But even in a recent study, 42% of students didn't actually access the feedback. And there's a predominant view of feedback as a teacher responsibility, as you can see in the National Student Survey questions. But feedback also needs to be a student responsibility. So students need feedback literacy. They need skills, dispositions, capacities in order to help them to engage with feedback and use it. Because feedback is useless if students don't use it, right? And my question is, what is the directionality between feedback literacy and feedback uptake? It's been assumed that we need feedback literacy before we can use feedback, but maybe also we gain feedback literacy through positive experiences of feedback uptake. And this is one of the premises behind my model. So recently we've seen some changes in the context of our feedback practices, and that changes the mode, the way that we deliver feedback, and that also changes the relationships involved, and all of these things mediate feedback uptake and feedback engagement and use. So there's a need for perspectives on feedback and literacy in online settings so that we can harness the advantages but minimize the disadvantages. And there's a gap in studies that employ dialogism in digital settings and that target feedback uptake. And not many dialogic studies have been successful thus far. So that's one of the main gaps I'm trying to address. And from a conceptual perspective, I take Carless and Boud's position that feedback is something that is co-constructed among feedback provider and feedback receiver. But unlike some of the important literature like the SAGE taxonomy, Winstone et al., and Carless and Boud, I think we also need to talk about the role of actual student and teacher dialogues in the process of feedback uptake. And that has been underexplored, especially in online settings, but in general it's been underexplored. So that led to the formulation of the model based on formative assessment theory, process approaches, psychological perspectives, as well as dialogic feedback theory, so Nicholl, Weygriff, Carless. And basically the framework is socio-constructivist. Technology-mediated dialogism mediates scaffolding for feedback uptake processes from peers. But I think we also need to look at the role of agency and how learner agency is also mediated by the learning environment, tools, technologies, as well as social and material interactions. So during COVID-19, we've talked about, if I'm eating dinner at this desk and also socializing at this desk. Can I also study at this desk? I think these things also mediate the agency that we have when it comes to learning effectively and feedback uptake and so on and so forth. Also, I want to reframe the role of peer feedback. Generally, peer feedback has been seen as mainly having benefits for the feedback giver. And it's been seen as there are some benefits to negotiating the meaning of feedback. But in my model, it's understood that technology can mediate but also distribute peer and teacher-student feedbacks among groups in ways that may not be possible without technology, and in ways that encourage learner agency to actually engage in those dialogues in ways that might not be possible without the technology. And the Dialogic technology-mediated feedback can be seen as co-regulation of zones of proximal development, Vygotsky. But it's not just peers or pairs, it can also happen in groups. And the technology facilitates this kind of group communication process. So this is a model. Dialogic technology-mediated peer feedback is an input. Students need to be able to understand what the standards are, or come to their own understanding of what the standards are, aided by exemplars and criteria and anything else they can, looking at good examples in the library, looking at journal articles and so on. And they need to be able to self-assess. So how close am I to where I want to be? Set goals, regulate those goals. And in the model, the technology-mediated dialogues with peers, but also with the teacher, support students going through those processes, but also it gives them motivation, it gives them some positive feelings to engage in the process, and it makes them more receptive to feedback as well. And then the output is improved uptake and improved feedback literacy as well. So I instantiated this using Google Drive and Docs for peer feedback, and students had to do a 1,200 word essay over a 16-week course. First was the preparation stage, looking at exemplars, criteria, modeling good practice, helping them to use the technology. For more about that, please read my paper. Students submitted the first draft, and then they had a week for peer feedback and ongoing peer feedback dialogue. It helps if you scaffold that so that they try to, well, really you can leave it to them, but suggest to them that they come up with deadlines. That seems to work in the subsequent studies I've done. Then they submit to the teacher and they get another week to discuss the feedback and implement the feedback. And then the final submission. And the research question was, what were the perceived effects on feedback uptake of the technology-mediated dialogic peer feedback practices? So we used their reflective writing, qualitative surveys to focus interviews. I had to admit, when I started the project, I didn't exactly know what I should be looking for. So looking at their qualitative surveys helped me to ask more questions about the interesting things that they said. And I used an inductive thematic coding process to try to capture their meaning in their language from their perspectives without me biasing the situation. And then I deductively tested what they came up with and my analysis of what they came up with against the model to see if the model needed to be improved. So there were three main results. And the first theme. So technology-mediated feedback dialogue, it did facilitate the negotiation of meaning, but also the development of the feedback points and students' ability to take perspective. So they found that they could question the feedback and understand why the peer recommended it. So not just understanding the feedback, but understanding where it's coming from. So getting an audience perspective was important. They felt they could refute the feedback, and it was sometimes the argument process that helped them to improve their understanding and their writing. And they felt very negatively about the peer feedback they'd received in the past, but very positively about feedback where they have a chance to discuss. So developing those points, getting that audience perspective. And this is an example of the kinds of discussions that they had. But it also evolved into learning cycles. So a student might get some feedback, set a goal, try to fix it, and then come back and say, how is it now? And they would say, yeah, it's better. Or they would say, try doing this or try doing that. So one interviewee said it wasn't just clarifying meaning, it was also building on it. And it was multiple peers helping in that building process. And the cycles might happen 3 or 4 times. So there might be 3 or 4 interactions about one actionable feedback step. So they ended up getting much more feedback from each other than they got from the teacher. And in a recent study that took place during COVID-19, the student said that he learned much more from his peers than he did from the teacher. And while I might have felt sensitive about that, that was also very good news to me, because it meant that this model is working and it continues to work. So feedback literacy involves making judgments and appreciating feedback. So understanding what good standards are and judging the quality of their work. And they said that peer review helped them with that. So giving other people feedback helped them to be critical and apply that to their own work. So as this comment shows. And the students also felt that as they saw other people's work improving, they appreciated feedback much more because they could see how it was working to improve other people's work. So at first they had very negative views about feedback, but that improved as a result of the peer feedback process. So we've seen something similar in the literature that in Zhu and Carless, students were able to negotiate the meaning of feedback and also better understand the quality of the feedback they were giving. But they found it very hard to meet outside class, and there wasn't enough time in class. So the conclusion was that there were these contextual difficulties stopping peer feedback practices from being effective. But in this study, peer feedback did lead to a perception of enhanced feedback uptake and use, and enhanced quality of actionable feedback over time. So that appears to be quite a unique finding. So learners had the chance to ask for feedback from the entire group. They put something on Google Classroom. I was using Classroom as my LMS, asking for feedback. And so they actually got feedback from people that were not inside their group originally, and then they became part of the group. They went through these cycles with their peers, these complete cycles. And they reported that this enhanced their evaluative judgment, their appreciation of feedback, and their uptake of feedback. So these are quite original findings in the literature thus far. And the second theme is that it helped them deal with the affective barriers and the relational barriers, and supported that aspect of their feedback literacy. So students talked about being afraid of feedback, and especially peer feedback, because it can destroy the relationships that they have. And in Confucian cultures, there are things that we have to worry about when an older peer gives feedback, a younger peer gives feedback to an older peer. And so they prefer to avoid that kind of situation. But they felt that when it was a conversation that had multiple points, they could feel much more comfortable. They could give much more tentative feedback, which would then be developed in a group discussion process. And they felt that the barriers to taking part went down as a consequence of maybe seeing other people's successful interactions, engaging in their own interactions. And they felt that this actually made them motivated. It created a synergy of reciprocal feedback relationships. They felt they were important to other people, so they felt that they were in a kind of alliance with their peers. and they felt like they weren't doing the work alone, and that really motivated them to work hard and improve. So we've seen in the literature that culture can negatively influence understanding of the concept and function, and also emotional reactions to feedback. And Carless and Boud and Carless and Winstone talk about the need to manage these relational difficulties or relational aspects of the feedback process. And the results show that the technological mediation did help learners to navigate these relational aspects, and I wasn't expecting that. I was aware of the problems, but I didn't expect the technology to be helping, really, from the very beginning of the project. So it also encourages reciprocation, this motivation and synergy. So as in the previous example, they felt it would be sinful not to use the feedback that other people are working so hard on. And it seemed to be that the literature talks about a pedagogic or educational alliance between the teacher and students, but this seems to be evidence of alliance of peers to help each other to make progress, and many positive benefits of that, effectively and emotionally. And then the third theme kind of talks about what's already obvious, that they were able to overcome the barriers of space and time. Using Google Drive over a week gave them time to consider each other's feedback, which improved the quality. And the space they had, if they were doing it on paper, they would run out of space. And even on Microsoft Word, I've never really seen very, very long comment dialogues because you have to email them to each other. But in this last comment, we can see that the comments were 10, 20 pages long. But the essay was only 8 pages long, so that's not really possible without the technology. They also said that they could get notifications so they could come back and take part in the discussion. That doesn't happen with a lot of systems. It's way easier, faster, more approachable than not having the technology. So the technology seems to be impacting their agency to get engaged. And they can do it on the mobile, they can do it on the train, and so on. So we've seen that undergraduates say they're more likely to engage with simple, convenient technologies. And these results show that if it's convenient, they can get notifications, they can use it on mobile, they've got time and space to discuss, then we seem to be getting social material agency and authorial agency, which Nimmonen et al. Talked about recently. The reference is on the last slide. So there's implications for the type of technology we use for scaffolding online dialogues, how to engage learners in peer feedback, and how technology can facilitate agency for peer feedback and engagement, but also how it can impede it. The wrong technology used in the wrong way without notifications can actually stop the process from working. And I think we saw that in the Phillips et al. Paper, where the online dialogue did not take off at all. So these findings inform the gap about dialogic peer feedback practices in online settings. And it demonstrates how many of the problems that have been found in previous studies can be overcome. And it illustrates how these processes can be supported. So I think it's useful for practitioners. It can be useful for large cohorts when it's not possible to give intense teacher feedback. And remember that the students felt that the peer feedback in many ways was higher quality, or at least more of it, and meeting their needs better. And I found it very workload positive. So basically, the role of technology here in navigating the cycles is the dialogic ongoing multiple term feedback and the online feedback community and dialogue results in this educational alliance with peers, which gives motivation to engage in this cycle, and it keeps them in the cycle. And I think they did much more work with each other than they did with me, although my feedback was also considered, effective and so on. So this has implications for how we teach teachers how to design feedback for feedback uptake, how we help teachers to deal with these relational sensitivities, and how we manage the practicalities, particularly in online and blended environments. And of course, there are limitations to mathematical claims about generalizability because this is a qualitative study. We need to look at how other teachers get along with these kinds of technologies if they're not tech savvy. And we need to consider ecological or socio-material factors in student feedback uptake and literacy. But finally, we can say that the findings evidence the model that I published recently, and I'll be publishing these findings recently, and so hopefully the papers can be seen together, one for a model and theory, and the other one for actual good evidence of that theory working. So in that sense, it makes practical and theoretical contributions, and Yin talks about case studies generalizing to theory when they're based on the literature, and then the empirical data can enhance the theory. And that informs teacher feedback literacy for digital settings. And for EAP practitioners, it exemplifies how the benefits of online environments can be leveraged. And it shows us how we can manage peer feedback in online settings. So this is, I think this shows, I've done this kind of work at King's College London. I've done it in the 5 years I've been at Seoul National University, and I've seen quite consistent results from this kind of work. And it does help learners to learn much more effectively and learn from each other and become much more agentic in their learning behavior. So if you're interested in reading more, you can read the theory paper, and hopefully this paper will be being published soon as well, so look out for that in assessment and evaluation in higher education. I'm currently responding to peer feedback about that. Feel free to add me on Twitter, and feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions or anything else that you'd like to talk about. So I'm open to collaborations if anybody would like to work on using these kinds of techniques in their courses, and of course measuring the results, ideally through mixed methods in the future. So thank you very much.